Now, before I dive in with analyzing Paul's words, I wanted to acknowledge this weekend where we are, because we are celebrating Pride in Baltimore City, the newly created federal holiday, Juneteenth, and Father's Day, all on the same 2-day period of time. Narratives around the joy and struggle of this day for queer rights may fill our minds this morning. Narratives around symbolic change, such as Juneteenth becoming a holiday before they managed to vote to protect voting rights in the Senate, may feel a little anemic. You might have narratives about fatherhood and fathering swirling around in your head. They may fill you with love and affection, or a mixture of grief and pain. And all of that is allowed. And God sees you and loves you through that. So this morning, my sermon is more about the posture of the heart that God invites us to have wherever we are. So I invite you to think about the state of your heart and your mind and what God may be calling you to do in response. Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Paul may sound a little desperate. He is struggling to get through to the Christians in Corinth what it takes to commit to following Jesus. He may even seem frustrated to them or angry as you read. The church in Corinth cannot seem to get themselves together. They cannot seem to accept Paul or his teachings. Other issues he's had with them in the past include several different things, such as people getting drunk during communion, the unequal division of food at church meals, and members of the church community continuing to sleep with temple prostitutes, just to name a few. So Paul is fed up, and he decides to appeal to them with nothing less but his raw honesty, hoping that this appeal will reach their hearts. Now, a letter like this would have been read out loud in front of the whole congregation because very few could read. And so if we were the church in Corinth, it might sound a little more like what the Message says in this same passage, which I will now read to you up here. Companions as we are in this work with you, we beg you, please don't squander one bit of this marvelous life God has given us. God reminds us, I heard your call in the nick of time. The day that you needed me, I was there to help. Well, now is the right time to listen, the day to be helped. Don't put it off. Don't frustrate God's work by showing up late, throwing a question mark over everything we're doing. Our work as God's servants gets validated, or not, in the details. People are watching us as we stay at our post, alertly, unswervingly, in hard times, tough times, bad times, when we're beaten up and jailed and mobbed, when we're working hard or working late, working without any food, with a pure heart or a clear head, with a steady hand, in gentleness, holiness, and honest love, when we're telling the truth and when God's showing God's power, when we're doing our best setting things right, when we're praised and when we're blamed, slandered and honored, true to our word though distrusted, ignored by the world but recognized by God, terrifically alive though rumored to be dead, beaten within an inch of our lives but refusing to die, immersed in tears, yet always filled with deep joy, living on handouts, yet enriching many, many having nothing, many having it all. Dear, dear Corinthians, I can't tell you how much I long for you to enter this wide open, spacious life We didn't fence you in. The smallness you feel comes from within you. Your lives aren't small, but you're living them in a small way. I'm speaking as plainly as I can and with great affection. Open up your lives. Live openly and expansively. Hearing it another time, I wonder if the words feel a little more relevant than they did the first time. I wonder if Paul sounds more like a real person and less like a distant biblical figure. I know it did for me, and I cannot help but wonder about Paul's intensity as a leader. His letters are full of passionate discourse, and he speaks of living the Christian life with integrity and commitment, but he seems to be at his wits' end with the church in Corinth. He wants them to stop harming themselves and their members and their surrounding community, and they don't seem to really be listening to him, either because they don't understand, they're not hearing what he asked, or they simply don't want to do what he is asking them to do. An interesting twist in this letter is that Paul tells them he is not asking them to do anything that he isn't already doing himself. He does not mince words with them. He explains to them that the wider culture, the Roman Empire, sees the gospel of Jesus Christ as so threatening that the only way to contain its followers is to beat them, to imprison them, to starve them. And yet he still asks them to open their hearts, not only to love, but to suffering. Paul is asking them to fully commit themselves to the way of Jesus, no matter what risks they may take, because that is what it means to Paul to accept the grace of God completely. This invitation to open our hearts to both love and suffering is an intense one coming from Paul. You might remember he had a dramatic conversion experience on the road to Damascus. He was radically transformed by encountering Jesus in a cloud of light so bright that it blinded him for a season. No longer was he intent on persecution of Jesus' followers. He would now become one of the strongest evangelists for the way of Jesus. But in this section of the letter, he seems to think that he can demand the same level of intensity and the same kind of commitment, particularly as someone who was bent on torturing and killing Christians in his previous life. I've often wondered if he felt a deep need for penance in his ministry, so others must respond in kind and be just as penitent and devoted as himself. I'm reminded of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? One of the greatest problems in history is that the concepts of love and power are usually contrasted as polar opposites. Love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. End quote. I sometimes wonder if Paul had this view of love and power at one point in his life. It is a common one, to be sure, even today. Leaders like Paul might be similar in your minds to those in our modern society who believe that they are set apart from the rest of the world. He sometimes reminds me of a harsh judge who might be in recovery or have a history of drug or alcohol use, who then harshly sentences others who are arrested for possessing or using drugs, or a pastor with a history of extramarital affairs or embezzlement who has changed their ways and demands their congregants to live up to a strict purity code or give significantly from their annual income to the church. In Paul's previous life, he lived as if love was weak and power was strong, but a particular kind of power, not the kind of power that we talk about in IAF organizing, but the kind of power that dominates and controls people, not the kind that brings people together or helps people discover the power already within them. Paul's reaction is so strong to the Corinthians that I think he has tried to create a new kind of dogmatism occasionally, a kind that demands a level of intense commitment from all the followers of Jesus in every place converts exist, even if their way of practicing Christianity does not look or sound like his own. While this metaphorical judge or pastor may have reacted strongly when confronted with someone who reminds them of their past self, and because the approach they are demanding worked for them, they demand others to use that same method themselves. Perhaps this is the Paul that we are encountering in this letter today, a man whose passion to save those like him causes him to strictly rely on those same methods for everyone simply because they worked. I believe that Paul's intentions are good and earnest, and I wonder if his approach just didn't work with this particular church. I wonder if they couldn't understand one another, which is partially why his frustration and intensity seem so clear. And yet, his love for them seems just as clear. Paul did not bring up any of their past transgressions in the section that we read today. Others may argue they hear his deep love for the church in Corinth coming off the page. He decides to recount all the ways that being a Christian looks. It means accepting God's grace so completely, without reservation. It means not putting any obstacles or restrictions or roadblocks in anyone's way so they can fully enter the community of faith. And Paul then recounts the various ways that he and Timothy, the co-author of this letter, live out their Christian faith through the suffering that they encounter in their ministry, through beatings and imprisonment and starvation, but they live with purity and knowledge and patience. And after this long list of ways they live, Paul implores them yet again. Our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. Or as the Message says it, I can't tell you how much I long for you to enter this wide open, spacious life. We didn't fence you in. The smallness you feel comes from within. Paul invites them to live a wide open, spacious life in this letter. He does not want to restrict others from full, vibrant lives of faith. He wants them to understand that he is not the one restricting them. The restriction they feel comes from within themselves. He tells them the smallness they feel comes from within you. Paul sees them having a half-life, not fully bought in on either side of living in the Christian community or fitting into Roman culture. He implores them to be all in by inviting them into a life that requires them to open their hearts wide to both love and suffering, to open their hearts wide to a powerful love that will transform them if they will allow it. But that love, that grace, cannot transform unless they stop living with restricted hearts. I'd like to bring back Martin Luther King for a brief moment and share the second half of the quote from Where Do We Go From Here? He concludes that paragraph by saying, what is needed is the realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. God demonstrates the kind of love that implements the demands of justice through this letter. God demonstrates the kind of justice that corrects everything that stands against love. And in this letter to the church in Corinth, Paul is inviting them to live with hearts so open that they can take in both the love and the suffering of life, the kind of wide open living that can lead to justice. Because it is in this kind of love that we can find our freedom and our power as people and as followers of Christ. It is in this kind of love that we find hope. It is in this kind of love that we encounter grace. And so I ask you, what are you willing to risk to live with this kind of wide, open heart? What are you willing to risk to live with this kind of power, the power that does not dominate, but will transform you. Open your hearts to that spacious love that leads to justice, power, and freedom. Because God is already there, waiting for you. Amen.